Before the sun has properly breached the horizon, a soft, pearlescent glow spreads across the vast, engineered expanse of the Western Barrier. Upon this immense mirror of water, so still it seems a sheet of polished obsidian, a lone figure poles a slender craft, his passage the only disturbance in the perfect reflection below. The rhythmic dip and pull of his bamboo pole is almost the only sound, a quiet punctuation in the profound stillness of the early morning. The air, thick and heavy with the coming day's heat, carries the faint, sweet perfume of lotus blossoms opening unseen along the water's edge. And in the distance, seeming to float between the water and the pale sky, the iconic, five-towered silhouette of a colossal temple complex resolves itself from the mist. Here, at the hydraulic heart of a kingdom built from water and stone, the world awakens not with a clamor, but with a slow, sacred breath, a testament to the intricate balance the Khmer had achieved between their gods, their king, and the monsoon-drenched earth itself. Good evening, and welcome back to Empires at Dusk. Tonight, we drift into the story of the Khmer Empire, a civilization that appeared to conjure a kingdom of stone and water directly from the monsoon-flooded heart of Southeast Asia. Guided by its god-kings, who from the sacred heights of Mount Kulen declared themselves divine, the Khmer raised a landscape of astonishing temples and intricate cities, whose sandstone towers were intended to mirror the heavens themselves. Their power was sustained by a masterful network of canals and vast reservoirs, the barriers, which tamed the wet season's deluge into a source of immense agricultural wealth, allowing their society to flourish for centuries before the great city of Angkor fell silent, and the jungle quietly began its patient reclamation. Before the first stone of Angkor was ever laid, and long before the faces of kings were carved into the living rock, there was the land itself, a vast and level canvas of green, defined by the rhythm of water. This was a world drenched in monsoon rains, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet decay of the jungle floor, a place where the boundary between forest and field, and between water and land, was perpetually in flux. The sun, when it broke through the humid haze, would bleach the sky to a pale, shimmering white, casting a diffuse light upon a landscape of immense fertility, a world humming with the constant, low thrum of insect life. One can perceive a world defined not by clear horizons and sharp mountains, but by the subtle gradations of a waterlogged plain, stretching out from the great river, the Mekong, whose annual pulse governed all of existence. At the very center of this world, breathing with the seasons, lay the Tunnel Sap, the Great Lake, a remarkable body of water that formed the geographical and spiritual heart of the Cambodian plain. For much of the year, it was a relatively modest lake, its waters draining gently southeastward into the Mekong. But as the summer monsoon swelled the great river with meltwater from the distant Tibetan plateau, a unique phenomenon occurred. The sheer volume of water would force the Tunnel Sap River to reverse its course entirely, flowing backwards to fill the lake like a vast, shallow basin. A fisherman poling his skiff along the shore in May would find his village submerged 10 meters beneath the surface by October, the water expanding across the surrounding forests and plains, swelling to more than 5 times its dry season size. This annual inundation, this gentle and predictable expansion of water, brought with it not devastation, but life, depositing a fresh layer of rich alluvial silt and trapping immense quantities of fish in the receding waters, a seemingly inexhaustible bounty that would form the bedrock of the civilizations to come. The entire rhythm of life, of planting and harvesting, of fishing and foraging, was dictated by this great, aquatic heartbeat. Upon this fertile, water-fed stage, the first large-scale political entities began to coalesce, their histories chronicled not in grand, continuous narratives, but glimpsed through the fragments of Chinese court records and the occasional stone inscription. The earliest of these, emerging sometime in the first centuries of the Common Era, was the kingdom known to the Chinese as Funan. It was not a landlocked power, but a thalassocracy, a loose federation of port cities clustered around the Mekong Delta and the coastline of the Gulf of Thailand. A traveler arriving by sea at a port like Oceo, a site now buried beneath the rice fields of southern Vietnam, would have encountered a bustling, cosmopolitan world where local mariners in their outrigger canoes mingled with merchants from distant lands. The air would have carried the scent of sandalwood incense and exotic spices, mingling with the briny smell of the tidal flats, while the sounds of many languages could be heard in the marketplaces. It was through these maritime connections that a profound and lasting transformation began, a process that modern historians called Indianization. This was not a conquest of armies, but a gradual and peaceful osmosis of ideas, carried in the holds of trading ships alongside cotton textiles and precious stones. Indian Brahmins, Buddhist monks, and worldly merchants brought with them not only goods but also new ways of understanding the cosmos and organizing a state. The local chieftains of Funan, seeking perhaps to elevate their status and more effectively govern their growing territories, eagerly adopted these foreign concepts. Sanskrit became the language of the court and of religion, its elegant script used for the first inscriptions on stone steles. The great gods of the Hindu pantheon, Shiva the creator and destroyer, and Vishnu the preserver, found new homes in modest brick shrines, their stories blending with local animist beliefs in the spirits of the forest, the water, and the ancestors. This was not a replacement of culture, but an enrichment, a grafting of a sophisticated philosophical and political framework onto a robust local rootstock, creating a unique and powerful synthesis that would define the region for a millennium. By the 6th century, the balance of power began to shift away from the coast and further inland, towards the agricultural heartlands of the Middle Mekong Basin. The maritime network of Funan seems to have waned, its influence receding as a new polity, known as Chenla, asserted its dominance. Chinese sources speak of a division of this new kingdom into two parts: Lan Chenla, in the north, a territory of hills and valleys, and Water Chenla, in the south, encompassing the floodplains and the Great Lake. This shift inland was pivotal, representing a turn from the transient wealth of trade to the enduring power that came from controlling land, water, and, most importantly, the production of rice. The early kings of Chenla, whose names survive on weathered stone steles, began to lay the groundwork for the future empire, sponsoring the construction of temples and, it is believed, the first rudimentary water management systems, small-scale precursors to the colossal engineering projects that would later reshape the entire landscape. The archaeological remains from this period speak of a society growing in complexity and ambition. One might find the ruins of a small, square brick tower, its surface once coated in a smooth white stucco, standing solitary in a rice field, a shrine to a Hindu deity that also served to legitimize the authority of the local ruler who commissioned it. These were the first attempts to render the divine in permanent materials, to build monuments that declared power not just over people, but over the land itself, sanctifying the territory and binding it to the king. The art of this era, in its surviving stone sculptures, shows a mastery of form, a serene and powerful aesthetic that already contains the seeds of the classical Angkorian style. Yet for all its cultural sophistication, Chenla remained politically fragile, its unity often more theoretical than real. As the 8th century drew to a close, the era of Chenla's unified control had passed, leaving behind a fractured political landscape. The Cambodian plain was not a single kingdom, but a mosaic of competing principalities, a collection of what one contemporary inscription calls a crowd of kings, each ruling over a small territory from a wooden palace fortified by an earthen wall and a moat. These were not times of widespread chaos or warfare, but rather a period of low-level, simmering rivalry and shifting allegiances. A sense of shared culture, language, and religious tradition undoubtedly persisted across this fragmented realm, a memory of the unity that had been. The rice fields were still planted according to the rhythm of the tunnel sap, the gods of India were still honored in the small brick temples, and the Sanskrit language was still used by the educated elite. The potential of the land and its people was immense, a latent energy waiting to be harnessed. But the land itself awaited a figure with the vision and the will to gather these disparate threads, to bind the crowd of kings into a single, indivisible whole, and to raise a unified kingdom from the endless green of the monsoon plains. The story of the Khmer Empire's genesis does not begin with a grand battle or a sudden discovery, but with the quiet return of a single man from a long period of exile. Towards the end of the 8th century, a prince, who would later be known to history as Jayavarman II, made his way back to the shores of his ancestral homeland from the island of Java, a place of sophisticated courtly life and potent spiritual ideas. One can almost feel the change in the air as his vessel left the orbit of the Sailendra dynasty, the scent of cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands gradually giving way to the more earthy fragrance of the mainland, the damp, vegetal smell of the monsoon-soaked earth. He had spent years in a gilded cage, observing how the Javanese kings commanded immense power, their authority rooted not just in military might, but in a profound connection to the divine, a lesson he carried with him across the sea, etched into his ambitions for the fragmented lands of his own people. Upon his return, Jayavarman found a landscape of competing principalities, a patchwork of petty kingdoms known collectively as Chenla, divided by their allegiances and their very geography into realms of the land and realms of the water. These were a people who shared a common tongue and a deep cultural memory, yet they lacked a unifying principle, a central point of gravity around which their world could revolve. Having witnessed the centralized power of the Javanese court, Jayavarman envisioned a new kind of kingdom, one forged not only through the force of arms but through the introduction of a revolutionary idea that could bind the souls of his people together as tightly as it bound their territories. His task was monumental, for it required him to reshape not just the political map of the region, but the very cosmos in which the Khmer people understood their place. To enact this profound transformation, Jayavarman turned not to a battlefield, but to a place of immense natural and spiritual power, the sacred mountain of Mahendraparvata, now known as Panam Kulan. The ascent would have been a pilgrimage in itself, a slow journey upward through the thick, humid air of the jungle, the path winding through a world of deep green shadows and shafts of brilliant, filtered sunlight. A traveler making the climb would have heard the distant, haunting calls of gibbons echoing through the canopy and felt the rough, damp texture of ancient sandstone outcroppings, covered in a soft blanket of moss. It was a world teeming with the spirits of the land, a place where the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical felt exceptionally thin, making it the perfect stage for the ceremony he intended to perform. Reaching the plateau at the summit, one finds a landscape that feels removed from the world below, a broad, elevated plain where the air seems clearer and the sky feels immeasurably closer. This was a natural temple, a place from which the great tunnel Sap Lake and the sprawling plains could be surveyed, a vantage point fit for a king with aspirations of divinity. It was here, far from the noise and politics of the lowland settlements, that Jayavarman chose to declare his new order, selecting a location that was itself a powerful symbol of elevation and a connection to the celestial realm. The very stones of the mountain seemed to possess a dormant sanctity, awaiting the ritual that would awaken them and consecrate the birth of a new empire. In the year 802, a date that echoes through Khmer history, a sacred and transformative ceremony took place upon that high plateau. Jayavarman had summoned a learned Brahmin priest named Hiranyadharma, who, according to the inscriptions, was skilled in the arcane science of magic and ritual, to perform a rite that would forever alter the destiny of the Khmer people. Through ancient Sanskrit chants and meticulously prescribed offerings, the ritual severed the bonds of vassalage that had tied the region to the distant authority of Java, declaring a new, sovereign independence. But it did more than that. It established the cult of the Devaraja, the God-King, a concept of profound and lasting power. The low hum of the Brahmin's verses would have mingled with the scent of burning ghee and fragrant incense, the smoke curling up towards the heavens as a signal of this new covenant. Through this sacred choreography, Jayavarman II was no longer merely a king among other kings, but was transformed into the earthly incarnation of a universal deity, a living conduit for the power of the god Shiva. He became a Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose authority was absolute, flowing not from the consent of his fellow chieftains but directly from the divine order of the cosmos itself. For the assembled lords of the various Khmer principalities, who witnessed this profound spiritual event, it was a moment of complete reorientation. Their old loyalties were dissolved and replaced by a singular, sacred allegiance to the man who was now both their sovereign and their god, a figure whose reign promised not just political unity but spiritual harmony and cosmic balance. The glint of ceremonial gold in the tropical sunlight was a reflection of a new dawn for the Khmer. With his divinity established, Jayavarman descended from the mountain to make this celestial mandate a terrestrial reality, embarking on a long and methodical process of consolidation that would occupy much of his reign. This was not a single, lightning campaign of conquest, but rather a patient and strategic weaving together of the disparate territories through a combination of relentless military pressure, astute diplomacy, and carefully chosen marital alliances. He moved his court several times, a nomadic kingship that allowed him to establish his presence and authority directly within the lands of his former rivals. Each new capital, from Indrapura to Haraharalaya, acted as a temporary anchor, a center from which he could pacify the surrounding region before moving onward, slowly drawing the entire plain into his orbit. This constant movement was a display of tireless energy, a king demonstrating his mastery over the land by traversing it, claiming it, and remaking it in his own image. His campaigns were directed against those who resisted the new order, but many chieftains likely saw the advantages of joining a powerful, unified kingdom that promised stability and a share in divinely sanctioned prosperity. The process was one of absorption as much as conquest, as local traditions and ruling families were incorporated into the new imperial structure. Their power diminished but their existence secured under the overarching protection of the Divaraja. Slowly, painstakingly, the patchwork of Chenla was being stitched together into a single, cohesive tapestry of empire. The people whose lives were being so profoundly reshaped were, for the most part, villagers and farmers, their existence dictated by the timeless rhythms of the monsoon and the cultivation of rice. They lived in wooden houses raised on stilts to keep them safe from the annual floods, their spiritual world a rich mixture of ancestor worship, local animist beliefs, and the Hindu deities that had been gradually introduced from India over centuries. Jayavarman's cult of the Divaraja did not seek to extinguish these deeply held beliefs, but rather to superimpose a grand, unifying framework upon them. The local spirits of the fields, the forests, and the waters were not banished, they were simply enrolled into a larger cosmic hierarchy, all of them now subject to the supreme power embodied by the God-King, whose divine favor ensured the fertility of the land and the well-being of its inhabitants. Eventually, Jayavarman's peripatetic court began to gravitate towards a particular stretch of land, a vast plain situated between the Kulin Hills to the northeast and the enormous, life-giving body of water known as the Tunnel Sap to the south. The genius of this location was not immediately obvious, for it was a landscape of subtle inclines, prone to severe flooding during the wet season and arid drought during the dry months. Yet, it held an extraordinary potential that Jayavarman and his engineers recognized. The hills provided a source of stone for building and, crucially, a year-round supply of water from their streams, while the Great Lake acted as a massive natural reservoir and an inexhaustible source of fish. The plain itself, with its gentle, consistent slope, was the perfect canvas for an unprecedented feat of hydraulic engineering. The vision that began to take shape was one of profound ambition, to tame the volatile cycle of the seasons and master the flow of water, the very lifeblood of a rice-growing civilization. The plan was to capture the immense deluge of the monsoon, storing it in vast, man-made lakes, and then distribute it systematically through a network of canals during the long, hot months of the dry season. This would not only guarantee the harvests and protect against the unpredictability of the climate, but it would also enable the cultivation of multiple rice crops per year, generating the immense agricultural surplus needed to feed a growing population, support a massive army, and fuel the construction of monumental temples. It was a plan to sculpt the kingdom quite literally from water and earth. Thus began the construction of the first great reservoirs, or barraris, colossal earthwork projects that required the mobilization of a vast labor force. One can picture the scene stretching out over years, a landscape animated by the steady, rhythmic work of thousands of laborers. The air would have been filled with the dull thud of hoes digging into the soil and the soft shuffle of countless feet as workers carried baskets of earth on their shoulders to build up the immense dikes, their movements coordinated like a slow, deliberate dance under the watchful eye of the sun. The first of these great works, the Indratatika Barri, associated with the capital of Haraharalaya, was a shimmering rectangle of water, more than 3 kilometers long, a testament to the king's power to command both his people and the natural world. These barraris were far more than just irrigation ponds, they were potent religious and political symbols. In the Hindu-Buddhist cosmology that shaped the Khmer worldview, the universe was centered on the mythical Mount Meru, the home of the gods, which was itself surrounded by a series of concentric mountain ranges and vast cosmic oceans. The barraris were the earthly representations of these celestial oceans, vast bodies of water that gave a sacred structure to the landscape. To build a barrari was to create a microcosm of the divine universe, with the king's temple mountain rising from its center like the mythical peak. The cool, still water, reflecting the sky, was a mirror of heaven, a tangible link between the domain of the gods and the kingdom of men. By controlling the water, the king was demonstrating, in the most practical and visible way possible, the legitimacy of his divine status. He was the great provider, the master of fertility, whose works ensured the prosperity and survival of his subjects. The canals that radiated from the barraris were like the arteries of the empire, carrying the life-giving water to the fields and binding every village and every farmer into a single, integrated system that was dependent on the center. This hydraulic network was the true foundation of the state, a web of engineering that was simultaneously a system of economic control, a political statement, and a work of religious art, all on a breathtaking scale. With the foundations of this water-based prosperity being laid, the first great stone monuments of the Angkor region began to rise from the plains. At Haraharalaya, which is today the Roluos group of temples, Jayavarman's immediate successors built the first temple mountains, stepped pyramids of brick and laterite, crowned with sandstone towers. The Temple of Bakong, completed by King Indravarman I, stands as a powerful example of this early phase, its 5 tiers representing the realms of mythical beings, culminating in a central sanctuary that housed the sacred essence of the king's divine power. A visitor to these early sites might have felt the texture of the porous, reddish laterite blocks, rough under the hand, and smelled the damp, earthy air inside the dark, narrow shrines where the symbols of Shiva were venerated in quiet solemnity. When Jayavarman II finally passed away in the year 850, after a reign of nearly half a century, he left behind a creation that was both a political reality and a powerful, enduring idea. He had taken a collection of scattered, warring chiefdoms and forged them into a unified kingdom. He had introduced a compelling ideology of divine kingship that would provide the spiritual glue for centuries to come. He had selected the geographical heartland that would become one of the most magnificent urban complexes in the pre-modern world, and he had initiated the vast hydraulic works that would be the engine of its growth and splendor. He was the architect of the Khmer Empire. His immediate successors, such as his son Jayavarman III and the powerful Indravarman I, did not deviate from this master plan but instead devoted themselves to its continuation and elaboration. They completed the barriers their predecessors had begun, built their own magnificent temple mountains, and further consolidated the kingdom's borders. The momentum was now irreversible. The capital would soon be moved a short distance to the northwest, to the site of Yasodharapura, which would grow into the sprawling complex we now know as Angkor. But the foundations, set so firmly by that returning prince, were now unshakable, rooted in the sacred waters of the Barris and the divine authority that emanated from the stone temples rising from the Cambodian plain. The Age of Angkor had truly begun. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. The true zenith of the Khmer Empire, the period etched most deeply into the memory of the world, begins not with the thunder of conquest, but with the quiet, determined chipping of sandstone. In the early 12th century, under the guidance of a king named Suryavarman II, the immense spiritual and material resources of the kingdom were marshaled for a singular, breathtaking purpose. The result was a structure that defies simple categorization, a temple that was also a mausoleum, a mountain, and a mandala rendered in stone, a place we have come to know as Angkor Wat. It represents a profound shift in Khmer construction, moving away from the earlier reliance on brick and the dark, porous laterite, and embracing the fine-grained, cream-colored sandstone that had to be quarried from the Kulin Hills, many miles distant, and rafted down the Siem Reap River to the construction site. One can only try to conceive of the sheer logistical scale, the tens of thousands of laborers and artisans, the elephants dragging immense blocks of stone along dusty causeways, all working in concert over decades to realize a divine vision. Angkor Wat was consecrated to the Hindu god Vishnu, the preserver, and its very layout was a physical manifestation of the Hindu cosmos, a microcosm of the universe designed to align the kingdom with celestial order. A wide moat, shimmering under the tropical sun and filled with the reflection of the sky, represented the mythical ocean of milk that surrounds the world. To cross the long stone causeway leading to the temple's main entrance was to leave the mundane world behind and begin an ascent into a sacred realm. The temple itself rises from the flat plain in 3 concentric rectangular galleries, each level higher than the one before it, culminating in a central quincunx of 5 lotus-bud towers that symbolize the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods. The effect upon a visitor arriving at dawn would have been one of sublime awe, as the rising sun, which the temple is precisely oriented to greet during the solstice, would silhouette those iconic towers, their stone surfaces seeming to absorb the gentle morning light and glow from within. The air would have been thick with the scent of jasmine and frangipani offerings, laid at the feet of countless statues by a constant stream of saffron-robed priests. The genius of Angkor Wat lies not only in its monumental scale but in its intricate and delicate detail, for almost every available surface of the inner galleries is covered in a vast tapestry of bas-relief carvings. These are not merely decorative elements but are instead narrative scrolls of stone, depicting scenes from the Hindu epics, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata, as well as historical processions that glorified the king himself. Here, one finds the famous depiction of the churning of the ocean of milk, a foundational Hindu creation myth, with ranks of gods and demons pulling on the body of a giant serpent to churn the cosmic sea and release the elixir of immortality. The figures are rendered with a fluid grace, their bodies seeming to move and strain against the stone, a testament to the unparalleled skill of the Khmer sculptors who somehow managed to imbue this hard material with a sense of life and dynamism. To walk these long, cool, dimly lit corridors is to read a sacred text, not with one's eyes alone, but with the slow passage of one's entire body through the architectural space, feeling the cool stone under one's fingertips. Decades after the last stone was set at Angkor Wat, a different kind of monarch ascended to the throne, a king whose vision would once again transform the heart of the empire. This was Jayavarman VII, a ruler who had endured invasion and personal tragedy, and who came to power late in life, embracing not the Hindu pantheon of his predecessors, but the compassionate teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. His reign was less a celebration of divine cosmology and more a profound act of public service written in stone and water. He embarked on one of the most ambitious building programs in human history, constructing a new capital city adjacent to Angkor Wat, a metropolis that would be known as Angkor Thom, or Great City. This was a far more worldly and protective space, a vast quadrangle nearly 2 miles on each side, enclosed by a formidable wall of laterite and a wide, crocodile-infested moat, as if to shield its inhabitants from the chaos of the outside world. At the very heart of this new city, Jayavarman VII erected his most enigmatic and personal creation, the Temple of the Bairn. Unlike the clear, sun-drenched geometry of Angkor Wat, the Bairn is a close, mysterious, and almost labyrinthine collection of towers and galleries. From its 54 Gothic spires, 216 colossal stone faces, each 4 meters high, gaze out with serene, half-closed eyes and a faint, knowing smile. For centuries, scholars have debated the identity of these faces, with most now believing they are a fusion of the compassionate Bodhisattva Lokeshvara and the king himself, suggesting a new form of kingship, one that watched over its people with benevolent, all-seeing compassion. To stand in the upper terraces of the Bairn, surrounded on all sides by these silent, smiling visages, is an unsettling yet deeply calming experience, as though one is in the presence of a quiet, eternal consciousness that permeates the very air. The light filters down through the close-set towers, creating a constant play of shadow and stone, while the sounds of the world outside seem to fall away into a reverent hush. Jayavarman's Buddhist faith manifested not only in temples but in a remarkable network of infrastructure that served the common people, a testament to a belief in karmic merit and social responsibility. Inscriptions from the time tell us that he founded a system of 102 hospitals, strategically placed throughout his vast kingdom, each with its own staff of physicians, assistants, and pharmacists who dispensed remedies made from local herbs. Alongside these, a web of rest houses, or houses with fire, were built along the major roads, providing shelter and a warm meal for merchants, pilgrims, and official messengers. One can imagine a weary traveler, perhaps a trader carrying spices and forest resins from the remote provinces, finding refuge at dusk in one of these simple wooden structures, grateful for the security of a roof and the comfort of a fire warding off the chill of the night jungle. This network was the physical expression of a state that had begun to conceive of its subjects not merely as laborers, but as people deserving of care and protection. Beyond the stone-walled cities and the sacred precincts of the temples, the vast majority of the Khmer people lived their lives in a different world, one made of wood, bamboo, and thatch, a world intimately tied to the rhythm of the monsoon. The great engine of the empire was not the king's court, but the endless expanse of irrigated rice paddies that surrounded it, a landscape engineered with breathtaking precision. The farmers, who formed the bedrock of Khmer society, lived in wooden houses raised high on stilts, a practical adaptation to the seasonal flooding that transformed the dry plains into a vast, shallow lake for several months of the year. From the cool, shaded space beneath their homes, they would have watched the waters rise and fall, their lives governed by the cycles of planting and harvest that had been followed for countless generations. Theirs was a life of strenuous labor, but also one of deep connection to the land and the water that sustained it. The agricultural year began with the first rains of the monsoon, when families would work together in the nurseries, carefully planting rice seedlings in the soft, muddy earth. As the waters rose, channeled and controlled by the intricate network of canals extending from the great reservoirs, the luminous green shoots would be transplanted into the larger paddies, a back-breaking task performed under the heat of the tropical sun. For months, the landscape would be a shimmering patchwork of greens and blues, the water reflecting the immense sky, the air filled with the croaking of frogs and the hum of insects. A traveler passing through the countryside would have seen figures stooped in the water, their wide-brimmed conical hats the only solid points in a liquid landscape. The harvest, once the waters receded, was a time of communal effort and cautious celebration, as the golden stalks of rice, the true wealth of the kingdom, were cut, bundled, and carried to the granaries that would feed the priests, the soldiers, the artisans, and the king. Life within the great city of Angkor Thom was a vibrant and multi-layered sensory experience, a stark contrast to the quiet, cyclical life of the countryside. A visitor entering through one of the monumental gates, perhaps the southern gate with its causeway lined by stone gods and demons, would have been immediately immersed in a world of bustling activity. The city was not a sterile monument but a living, breathing organism, where the stone temples of the gods stood amidst a sprawling metropolis of wooden houses, workshops, and markets. The air itself would have carried a complex blend of aromas, the sweet, heavy scent of incense drifting from the temple compounds, the sharp, pungent smell of fermented fish paste, or prahok, a staple of the Khmer diet, and the delicate fragrance of jasmine and lotus blossoms woven into garlands as offerings. From the market stalls, one might catch the scent of charcoal fires cooking freshwater fish pulled from the tunnel sap lake, mixed with the earthy smell of galangal and lemongrass. The sounds of the city would have been just as varied, a constant, low hum of human enterprise. From the temple enclosures, one might hear the deep, resonant tone of a bronze gong calling monks to prayer, or the high-pitched chanting of sacred texts. In the distance, the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of countless chisels on stone would provide a constant reminder of the construction that never truly ceased, as new temples were built and old ones embellished. The marketplace would have been a cacophony of voices haggling in the Khmer tongue, the clucking of chickens, the squeal of pigs, and the laughter of children. The visual landscape was one of profound contrasts, the eternal, grey stone of the temples standing next to the perishable wooden homes of the people, many of which, according to a visiting Chinese chronicler, were brightly painted and decorated with carvings. The elite, carried through the streets in shaded palanquins, would have been draped in brightly colored silks, their patterns perhaps shimmering with threads of gold, a stark contrast to the simple cotton sarongs of the farmers and laborers. This complex society was organized into a rigid, yet divinely ordained, hierarchy that radiated outwards from the single person of the king. At the apex was the Devaraja, the god-king, a sovereign who was not merely a political or military leader but a living conduit between the earthly realm and the heavens. His every action was imbued with ritual significance, and his primary duty was to maintain cosmic order through the performance of elaborate ceremonies, ensuring the timely arrival of the rains and the prosperity of the kingdom. Advising him was a powerful and educated class of Brahmin priests, men who were masters of Sanskrit, astronomy, and the sacred rituals, and whose influence was essential in legitimizing the king's divine status. Below them were the high officials of the state, the ministers, judges, and military generals who managed the day-to-day administration of a sprawling empire. They commanded armies, oversaw the construction of public works, and dispensed justice according to the king's law. Further down this great ladder of being were the skilled artisans, the architects, sculptors, and bronze casters who gave physical form to the visions of the kings and priests. These were not anonymous laborers but highly respected masters of their craft, whose names are now lost to us but whose collective genius is permanently preserved in the temples they built and adorned. They worked in dedicated guilds, passing their secrets from father to son, their hands shaping the very identity of the Khmer civilization. And supporting this entire superstructure, forming its broad and unshakable foundation, was the vast majority of the population, the rice farmers, the fishermen, the soldiers, and the quarry workers. They were the source of the kingdom's food, its labor, and its defense. While they were bound by duty and taxation to the state, their lives were not without their own rich traditions, festivals, and beliefs, a folk culture that ran parallel to the high religion of the court. This entire system, from the farmer in his paddy to the king on his throne, was seen not as a system of oppression, but as a natural and harmonious order, a reflection on earth of the perfect hierarchy of the heavens. For a population that was largely illiterate, the temples themselves served as vast libraries of stone, their walls covered in detailed bas-reliefs that communicated the core tenets of their religion, the glories of their history, and even the mundane details of their everyday lives. These carvings were a public book, open for all to see and understand. At Angkor Wat, the galleries offer an encyclopedia of Hindu mythology, where one can follow the epic battles of gods and demons, the heroic quests of princes, and the intimate lives of divine beings. One particularly vivid panel depicts the 32 hells and 37 heavens of Hindu cosmology, a graphic and sobering reminder of the consequences of one's earthly actions. The artists took great care to render not just the divine, but the real, and the historical reliefs showing Suryavarman II's army on the march are a treasure trove of information, showing the different ranks of soldiers, their weapons, their uniforms, and the officers riding atop fearsomely decorated war elephants. At the Bairn, built under a Buddhist king, the subject matter of the relief shifts to reflect a greater interest in the lives of ordinary people. Here, alongside scenes of royal processions and naval battles against the neighboring Khams, one finds wonderfully animated vignettes of daily life in 12th century Angkor. There are scenes of a bustling marketplace, with vendors selling fish and vegetables, a woman having her purse snatched by a thief, men gathered around a fire, roasting meat for a feast, and even a depiction of a hospital, with patients being attended to by physicians. These carvings possess a remarkable immediacy and charm, capturing moments of humor, commerce, and domesticity with a keen and observant eye. They reveal a world where cockfighting was a popular pastime, where acrobats and jugglers entertained crowds, and where simple family life unfolded in the shadow of the great temples. To study these reliefs is to look through a window into a lost world, seeing the Khmer people not as abstract builders of monuments, but as individuals with lives as rich and complex as our own. The stone, worn smooth by the passage of nearly 1,000 years of monsoon rains, still speaks with a clear and compelling voice. The engine that powered this entire spectacular civilization, that fed the armies, supported the priesthood, and freed up the hundreds of thousands of laborers required to build the temples, was the Khmer mastery over water. The empire's prosperity was not based on gold or conquest alone, but on the agricultural surplus generated by an ingenious and vast water management system, the scale of which is difficult to comprehend even today. The key to this system were the enormous reservoirs, known as barrages, which were essentially man-made lakes, some of them several miles long and wide, designed to capture and store the massive volume of water from the monsoon season. The West Barrage, for instance, is a perfectly rectangular body of water measuring 8 kilometers by 2, a staggering feat of engineering that would have required the moving of millions of cubic meters of earth. From these immense reservoirs, a complex grid of canals and channels distributed the water with gravitational precision across the plains, allowing for the controlled irrigation of tens of thousands of acres of rice paddies. This system was revolutionary because it liberated the Khmer from a dependence on the unpredictable timing of the annual rains. By storing the monsoon's bounty, they could release water during the dry season, guaranteeing a successful harvest and, in many areas, enabling them to produce 2 or even 3 crops of rice per year. It was this reliable and massive surplus of food that formed the true economic bedrock of the empire. This wealth of rice was the currency that paid for the sandstone, the armies, the silks, and the gold leaf. It sustained a large, specialized, non-farming population in the cities, allowing a culture of art, scholarship, and religion to flourish on a scale rarely seen in the pre-modern world. The water, tamed and channeled, was the lifeblood of Angkor, and the canals that crisscrossed the landscape were the arteries that carried this life to every part of the kingdom, sustaining a brilliant civilization in the heart of the jungle for centuries. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. The vast and frenetic energy that had defined the reign of Jayavarman VII, that whirlwind of stone and faith, could not be sustained indefinitely across the generations. A quiet exhaustion began to settle over the plains of Angkor, a weariness that was not born of defeat, but of the sheer, century-spanning effort of raising a city of gods from the earth. Each towering temple, from the celestial majesty of Angkor Wat to the enigmatic faces of the Bairn, represented a staggering expenditure of human life and labor, a mountain of quarried sandstone and laterite dragged and carved and hoisted into place under the unforgiving sun. The sound of a million chisels, which had for so long been the Empire's dominant music, began to seem less like a hymn of creation and more like a sigh of depletion, its echo lingering in the air long after the last artisan had laid down his tools. One might have felt it in the villages scattered along the royal roads, a subtle shift in the balance of obligation and reward, as the demands for labor and rice to feed the temple cities grew ever more insistent. The quarries on Mount Kulin, though they seemed inexhaustible, bore the scars of centuries of relentless extraction, their gouged faces a testament to the kingdom's divine ambition. The logistical train required to move a single multi-ton block of stone from the mountain to the capital was a marvel of organization, but it was a marvel that ran on the sweat of men and the steady consumption of the kingdom's surplus. For generations, this system had been the engine of Khmer identity and power, but like any engine running constantly at its peak, the internal components were beginning to show the strain of accumulated stress. The very success of the Devaraja cult, the belief in a god-king whose divinity was expressed through monumental construction, had locked the empire into a cycle of perpetual, competitive building. Each new monarch felt the implicit pressure not merely to maintain the works of his predecessors, but to surpass them, to leave his own indelible mark upon the sacred landscape in a way that confirmed his unique connection to the heavens. This divine mandate was a source of immense authority, allowing kings to mobilize resources on a scale almost unparalleled in the ancient world, yet it also became a profound and burdensome inheritance. The state's resources, both human and material, were being poured into stone and ritual, leaving less in reserve for the more prosaic, yet equally vital, tasks of maintaining frontiers and adapting to a changing world. And indeed, the world beyond the Khmer frontiers was no longer the collection of pliant vassal states and scattered chieftainships that it had once been. While the architects and priests of Angkor had been gazing inward and upward, consumed with the geometry of the sacred, new powers had been coalescing in the west, their ambitions growing in the shadow of the great empire. The first stirrings came from the Thai kingdom of Sukhothai, a former Khmer provincial outpost that had asserted its independence in the 13th century, creating a new political and cultural center that began to draw the allegiance of peoples along the empire's western fringe. Though initially a secondary concern, Sukhothai's rise was a clear signal that the era of unquestioned Khmer hegemony was drawing to a quiet close. Of far greater consequence, however, was the emergence of the Kingdom of Ayutthaya, further south along the Chao Phraya River, a new and dynamic power with a formidable military and a hunger for expansion. Unlike the Khmer, whose power was rooted in an agrarian society managed by a complex water system, Ayutthaya was also a maritime and mercantile power, its gaze turned as much to the sea lanes and trade routes as to the rice paddies. The Ayutthayan kings learned much from their powerful neighbor, adopting elements of Khmer court ritual, administration, and even the concept of divine kingship, yet they reforged these elements into something new, something more aggressive and commercially minded. The first border skirmishes were likely dismissed in Angkor as minor irritations, but they were the harbingers of a fundamental shift in the region's balance of power, a gathering storm that was slowly moving eastward. These external military pressures began to place an ever greater strain upon the same resources already stretched thin by the demands of temple construction and maintenance. The need to garrison the western provinces and to fund campaigns against these increasingly confident rivals diverted labor and wealth away from the heartland. A farmer who might once have been conscripted for a season to haul stone for a new temple gallery might now find himself conscripted for years to serve in a distant border war, his absence felt deeply in the rice fields of his home village. The steady flow of tribute and resources from the western territories began to falter, and then to reverse, as Ayutthaya's influence grew, slowly starving the imperial center of the surplus it had for so long taken for granted. At the very same time, a more insidious and perhaps more fundamental crisis was developing within the empire's core, a problem not of stone or swords, but of water. The entire Khmer civilization rested upon the intricate and ingenious network of canals, reservoirs, and embankments that had transformed the unpredictable monsoon cycle into a reliable source of agricultural wealth. The Great Barriers, those vast, man-made lakes shimmering like inland seas, were the heart of this system, storing the torrential rains of the wet season to be carefully distributed through a vascular network of channels during the dry months. This hydrological mastery had allowed for multiple rice harvests per year, supporting the immense population of laborers, priests, and soldiers required to build and defend the empire. It was a magnificent, but profoundly delicate, piece of machinery. This system, however, required constant, meticulous, and centralized management. The canals needed to be dredged of silt, the embankments repaired after every monsoon, and the sluice gates operated with precision. Such work demanded a stable and powerful central authority capable of mobilizing labor and enforcing its decrees across the entire floodplain. As the kings became increasingly preoccupied with dynastic struggles, religious schisms, and the growing threat from Ayutthaya, the archaeological record seems to suggest a gradual decline in the maintenance of this vital infrastructure. A canal, once clear and flowing, might slowly choke with sediment and weeds. A reservoir embankment, weakened by neglect, might one day breach during a particularly fierce storm, causing catastrophic flooding in one area and drought in another. Furthermore, some scholars now believe the Khmer may have been the victims of profound climatic shifts far beyond their control. The period from roughly 1300 onwards coincides with the beginning of the Little Ice Age in Europe, a global climate event that had far-reaching and unpredictable effects. For Southeast Asia, this may have manifested as a series of prolonged and severe droughts, punctuated by unusually intense and destructive monsoons. The water management system, so brilliantly designed for the consistent climate of previous centuries, may have been unable to cope with these new, violent extremes. A decade-long drought could have rendered the Great Barriers nearly useless, their cracked beds exposed to the sky, while a subsequent supermonsoon could have overwhelmed the neglected channels and swept away entire sections of the network in a torrent of brown water. A traveler journeying through the Khmer countryside in the late 14th century might have noticed the subtle signs of this decay. The water in a secondary canal might appear stagnant and choked with lily pads, smelling faintly of mud and rot rather than the fresh scent of flowing water. In the fields, the once vibrant green of the rice shoots might seem patchy and withered in places, the intricate grid of paddies showing signs of salinization or waterlogging. These were not dramatic, singular events, but a slow, creeping dysfunction, a gradual loss of the precision and control over the environment that had been the hallmark of the empire at its zenith. The land, which the Khmer had so masterfully tamed and sculpted, was beginning to quietly reassert its own wild and unpredictable rhythms. Into this environment of internal exhaustion, external threat, and ecological uncertainty, a new spiritual current began to flow, one that would ultimately prove to be as transformative as any invading army. For centuries, the state religion had been a syncretic blend of Hinduism, primarily the worship of Shiva and Vishnu, and Mahayana Buddhism, all of which could be accommodated within the overarching ideology of the Devaraja. These were religions of grand temples, complex rituals, and a priestly caste, perfectly suited to a hierarchical society ruled by a god-king. But from the south, carried along trade routes and by wandering ascetics from Sri Lanka, a different form of Buddhism began to gain purchase among the common people, Theravada Buddhism. Its appeal was simple and profound. In contrast to the grand, collective works of the state cults, Theravada offered a path to enlightenment and salvation that was personal and accessible to every individual, regardless of their station in life. It required no monumental temples, no intermediaries from a hereditary priesthood, and no divine king. Its monks, clad in simple saffron robes and carrying only an alms bowl, walked among the people in the villages and towns, teaching a doctrine of detachment, merit, and self-discipline. The quiet dignity and humility of these monks presented a stark and compelling contrast to the opulence and power of the state's religious elite. One might have observed a village that once sent its sons to labor on a new state temple now choosing instead to build a simple wooden wat for a revered local monk. This gradual, grassroots conversion was not a violent revolution, but a slow and quiet hollowing out of the empire's central ideological pillar. When a farmer or a craftsman adopted the Theravada path, his worldview shifted. The act of quarrying stone for a massive temple to Vishnu, a god his ancestors had worshipped, might lose its sacred urgency. The divine right of the king to command his labor for such a project would no longer seem an absolute and unquestionable truth. The king was still the king, a powerful secular ruler to be obeyed in worldly matters, but his status as a living god, a Devaraja, began to lose its potent grip on the popular imagination. The cosmic justification for the immense sacrifices demanded by the state was slowly dissolving, not in the face of rebellion, but through the quiet pursuit of a different kind of peace. This religious transformation accelerated the other pressures mounting on the empire. A population increasingly devoted to the more egalitarian and individualistic tenets of Theravada Buddhism was less likely to embrace the immense collective sacrifice needed for massive state projects or prolonged, costly wars. The merit-making of supporting a local monastery and its monks became a more immediate and spiritually satisfying goal than contributing to the distant glory of a monarch in Angkor. The social cohesion that had been forged in the fires of a shared, state-directed faith began to weaken, replaced by a more localized and personalized religious identity. The kings themselves eventually converted, with the state officially adopting Theravada Buddhism by the 14th century, but in doing so, they effectively dismantled the very theological apparatus that had granted their predecessors such absolute power over the land and its people. And so, by the dawn of the 15th century, the great Khmer Empire found itself in a profoundly vulnerable position, weathered by a confluence of long-developing crises. Its economy and workforce were depleted by centuries of monumental construction that had reached a point of diminishing returns. Its borders were being relentlessly tested by the organized and ambitious military of Ayutthaya, a rival who had learned the Khmer's own lessons of power and turned them against their former masters. Its agricultural heartland, the very source of its lifeblood, was becoming dangerously unreliable, the result of a decaying infrastructure and, perhaps, a hostile climate. And most fundamentally, the shared belief system that had justified the entire imperial enterprise, the cult of the God-King, had been gently but irrevocably replaced by a new faith that prized individual salvation over collective glory. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were visible in the silted canals, in the undermanned garrisons on the western frontier, and in the quiet deference shown to a wandering monk over a royal official. The empire was like one of its own aging temples, a magnificent and awe-inspiring structure, but one whose foundations had been slowly undermined by water, whose stones were being loosened by the persistent pressure of the jungle, and whose inner sanctuary no longer housed the vibrant, commanding faith it once had. It was still standing, proud and immense against the sky, but it was hollowed out, brittle, and awaiting the final, decisive push that would bring the long centuries of its golden age to a close. The formidable weight of the centuries had begun to press upon the Khmer, a pressure that emanated not from within, but from the rising ambitions of its neighbors to the west. The kingdom of Ayutthaya, a young and vigorous Thai state forged from a confluence of martial prowess and shrewd diplomacy, began to cast a long shadow across the plains, its gaze fixed upon the jewel of the Khmer realm, the sprawling sacred metropolis of Angkor. The initial conflicts were not the grand, decisive battles of dynastic foundation, but rather a persistent and attritional series of raids, like the worrying of a wound that would not be allowed to heal. Ayutthayan armies, disciplined and mobile, would appear with the dry season, testing the formidable outer defenses of the Khmer capital, their incursions growing bolder with each passing year, each successful foray carrying away not just plunder, but a measure of Angkor's treasured sense of invincibility. For the citizens of the great city, the sound of distant war horns, once a signal of their own king's triumphant campaigns, now became a recurring note of anxiety on the hot, dusty air, a premonition that the serene order of their world was no longer guaranteed by the gods or their Devaraja. The chronicles suggest a growing weariness within the Khmer court, a slow bleeding of resources and confidence as the kingdom was forced onto a permanent defensive footing. The vast wealth that had once been channeled into the construction of new temples and the maintenance of the life-giving barriers was now diverted to the raising of armies and the frantic repair of fortifications. A traveler approaching the capital during this period might have noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere, the usual bustle of pilgrims and merchants mingling with the grim processions of soldiers marching towards the frontiers. The intricate carvings on the temple galleries, which depicted glorious victories of the past, now stood in silent contrast to the uncertain present, their stone figures telling a story of a power that was beginning to feel the first tremors of its own eventual twilight. The raids became a part of the rhythm of life, a seasonal threat that drained the countryside of its young men and its rice stores, leaving the heart of the empire increasingly isolated and vulnerable, a magnificent but solitary island in a sea of rising hostility. The divine mandate of the God King, once unquestioned, must have felt heavier with each report of a village burned or a provincial garrison overrun, the celestial protection seeming ever more distant. The culmination of this long attrition arrived in the year 1431, a date that marks the great and sorrowful turning point in the Khmer story. The Ayutthayan king Boromarakathirat II launched a full-scale invasion, a meticulously planned campaign aimed not merely at plunder, but at the very decapitation of the empire. The siege of Angkor, historical accounts suggest, lasted for many months, a slow and agonizing strangulation of the world's most magnificent city. Within the high laterite walls, the remaining defenders would have watched their supplies dwindle, the waters in the moats perhaps fouled, the reassuring routines of ritual and daily life fractured by the constant threat beyond the gates. The final assault, when it came, was not a moment of heroic spectacle, but a brutal and methodical conquest that broke the city's spirit along with its defenses. The sounds of battle would have echoed through the sacred enclosures and colonnaded galleries, a shocking violation of a space designed for cosmic harmony and quiet contemplation. In the aftermath of the breach, a heavy, smoke-filled silence descended upon the boulevards and plazas of Yasodharapura. The Ayutthayan forces did not simply sack the city in a fit of chaotic violence, their actions were chillingly deliberate, aimed at transferring the soul of the Khmer kingdom to their own capital. They came for the things that could not be easily replaced, the knowledge, the artistry, and the sacred authority that Angkor embodied. Soldiers moved through the royal libraries and temple repositories, gathering not just gold and jewels, but the palm leaf manuscripts that contained generations of learning in astronomy, literature, and statecraft. More devastating still was the systematic rounding up of the kingdom's intellectual and cultural elite. Thousands of individuals, the master sculptors whose hands knew the secrets of shaping sandstone into divine forms, the graceful court dancers who embodied the sacred stories of the gods, the Brahmin priests who maintained the ancient rituals, and the engineers who understood the intricate workings of the city's hydrology were taken. One can picture the long, sorrowful procession of these captives, the architects of Angkor's glory, being led away in chains towards a new life in a foreign land, their departure leaving behind a profound and irreparable void. The city was not burned to the ground, but it was hollowed out, its treasures and its most brilliant minds carried away, leaving a beautiful but empty shell. Faced with this crippling blow, the Khmer court made a decision that was both pragmatic and deeply poignant. King Ponhiayat, surveying the looted palaces and desecrated temples of his ancestors, recognized that Angkor, for all its spiritual significance, had become a strategic liability. The city was too far inland, too difficult to defend against the ascendant military power of Ayutthaya, and its agricultural wealth was now too easily threatened. The future, the king and his advisors concluded, lay not in the old heartland of the rice paddies, but to the south, along the great arteries of the Mekong and Tunnel Sap rivers, where trade and maritime connections offered a different kind of prosperity and a more defensible position. And so, the order was given to abandon the ancestral home, to leave behind the stone mountains that had been the earthly abode of the gods for over 500 years. It was a decision born of necessity, a recognition that the world had changed and that the empire, if it were to survive at all, must change with it. The exodus from Angkor was not a panicked flight, but a somber and organized relocation of what remained of the Khmer state. Royal barges, laden with the surviving members of the court, the emblems of kingship, and the sacred idols that could be rescued, were prepared for the journey southward. One can imagine the final ceremonies held in the half-empty halls of Angkor Thom, the last prayers whispered before the serene, smiling faces of the Ben, whose gaze now seemed to watch over a city preparing for its own long sleep. As the royal flotilla drifted slowly down the Siem Reap River towards the vast expanse of the Tunnel Sap Lake, those aboard might have taken a final look back at the iconic quincunx of towers of Angkor Wat, shimmering in the humid air, the embodiment of a grandeur that they were now leaving behind forever. The journey itself was a passage into a different world. The cool, solid stone corridors of the temples were exchanged for the damp wood of riverboats, the immensity of the stone-lined barriers replaced by the shifting currents and mangrove-choked banks of the Mekong Delta. It was the end of the era of the god-kings and the beginning of a new, more worldly chapter for the Khmer people, centered on new capitals like Longvek and, eventually, Phnom Penh. And in the north, the great city of Angkor began its slow, quiet surrender to the forest. The first and most critical failure was the water management system, the very circulatory system that had been the foundation of the empire's power. Without the constant labor of thousands, the kilometers of canals that fed the rice fields began to silt up, their once clear water slowing to a murky trickle before stopping altogether. The immense barriers, the man-made seas that regulated the seasonal floods, were no longer maintained. Their great earthen and stone dikes, once patrolled and repaired by royal engineers, were breached by the monsoon rains, allowing the water to drain away or stagnate. The carefully leveled paddies, which had produced multiple harvests a year, slowly reverted to their natural state, becoming seasonal swamps or tangled thickets of brush. The intricate balance between humanity and water, perfected over centuries, was broken, and with it, the economic engine of Angkor ceased to function. The city could no longer feed itself, and the remaining population of farmers and caretakers drifted away, seeking sustenance elsewhere. With the departure of humanity, the jungle, which had been held at bay for half a millennium, began its patient and inexorable reclamation. The process would have been almost imperceptibly slow at first. A single seed, carried by a bird or the wind, would find purchase in a crack in a sandstone gallery. Its roots, fine as thread, would probe the joints between the massive, unmortared stones, seeking moisture and purchase. Over years and decades, these roots would thicken, growing with a silent, immense force that could topple a multi-ton block of stone from a temple pediment or force apart the serene face of a carved deity. The most dramatic agents of this reclamation were the strangler figs and silk cotton trees. Their seeds would germinate high on the temple towers and walls, sending down a cascade of aerial roots that wrapped around the stone structures like a living shroud. These roots would eventually reach the earth, thickening into powerful trunks that embraced the temples in a seemingly eternal grip, merging nature and architecture into a single, haunting entity. The city's ambient sounds began to change. The distant murmur of markets, the chanting of monks, and the footsteps of pilgrims faded from the air, replaced by a new chorus. The chatter of gibbons and macaques began to echo from the highest towers of Angkor Wat, and the deep hum of insects became the prevailing sound in the once bustling courtyards of the Bairn. The wide, straight avenues, once paved and processional, were obscured by a carpet of fallen leaves and then broken apart by saplings, eventually becoming little more than winding paths through the dense undergrowth. A traveler venturing into the area a century after its abandonment would have found not a city, but a forest of man-made hills and stone clearings, a place of profound and overwhelming silence. The temples, once bright with painted stucco and gilded spires, now took on the greens and greys of the jungle, their surfaces softened by a thick blanket of moss that felt cool and damp to the touch. Angkor faded from the political and economic maps of Southeast Asia, receding into the realm of legend. For the Khmer people who now lived along the rivers to the south, it became a half-remembered place of origins, the mythical domain of ancient giants and divine kings, visited only by the occasional ascetic monk on a solitary pilgrimage. The causeways collapsed, the moats filled with vegetation, and the city that had once been the center of a vast and powerful cosmos was effectively lost to the outside world for nearly 400 years. It lay sleeping under its blanket of trees, its stone gods keeping watch over a kingdom of roots and vines. The moonlight would filter through the collapsed roof of a gallery, illuminating a row of celestial apsaras, their graceful dance now performed only for the silent observation of the jungle night. The fall of Angkor was not a singular, fiery cataclysm, but a slow, quiet, and almost peaceful process of dissolution, a gentle return of stone to the earth from which it had been raised, fulfilling the cycle of creation and decay as the empire itself receded into the dusk of memory. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. And so, the great city of Angkor fell silent, its avenues no longer thronged with merchants and pilgrims, its vast barriers no longer shimmering with the controlled, life-giving waters of the monsoon. A visitor today, standing before the 5 lotus towers of Angkor Wat as the morning mist lifts from the moat, might feel the profound stillness of a world returned to itself, the silence so deep it seems to have weight. The air, once thick with the murmur of a million people and the scent of cooking fires and temple offerings, now carries only the distant calls of gibbons and the electric hum of insects in the humid air. The water that was once the kingdom's lifeblood, meticulously channeled and stored with an engineer's precision, now lies placid and green, reflecting a sky empty of the gods who were once believed to dwell just beyond the veil. The very stones, cool and moss-slick to the touch, seem to hold the memory of a departed age within their ancient grain. It was an ambition born of the mountain and the monsoon, this kingdom of the Khmer, founded upon the audacious declaration of a king who saw himself as a god on earth, a Divaraja whose authority flowed directly from the heavens. This divine mandate was written into the very fabric of the landscape, an idea that traveled from the sacred slopes of Mount Kulin into the heart of every subject. The sandstone itself seems to remember the purpose it was given, whether to honor Vishnu in Suryavarman II's celestial palace of Angkor Wat, or to embody the compassionate, all-seeing watchfulness of Jayavarman VII in the serene faces of the Bairn. For centuries, these stones were not merely structures but anchors for belief, cosmic diagrams designed to harmonize the earthly realm with the celestial, allowing the rice farmer in his fields to feel connected to the very order of the universe. Each carved relief was a story told for eternity, each tower a conduit to the divine, each causeway a bridge between the world of men and the abode of gods. Yet even a kingdom built to last for eternity could not outpace the patient rhythms of nature and the shifting tides of human fortune. The sacking of the capital by the armies of Ayutthaya in 1431 was a deep and traumatic wound, but the empire's quiet dissolution was a process that had perhaps already begun, as the complex system of canals and reservoirs faltered and the state religion itself transformed. The older, hierarchical worship of god-kings gave way to a more personal, monastic form of Buddhism, and with it, the cosmological imperative to build ever grander temples faded. The jungle, which had been held at bay for 6 centuries by sheer force of will and engineering, began its slow, inexorable return. Strangler figs wrapped their woody tendrils around the galleries of forgotten temples, their roots patiently prizing apart the heavy stones that had once formed the foundations of the world. The empire did not vanish in a single, fiery cataclysm. It was instead gently absorbed, its grand avenues becoming forest paths, its sacred precincts returning to the silent, green twilight from which they had first been raised. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk.